What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the daily puzzle series. And today we're tackling another puzzle in the 2000 to 2200 range. So, looking at this position, our opponent has some issues with his king safety. We have a queen and a rook that's penetrated to the second rank and is threatening his king with a bunch of different checks and other ideas. And we are also down, it looks like, a little bit of material. So we have a queen for a rook and a knight, and then a rook and a knight for a rook and a knight by our opponent. And he's got two extra pawns. No, he's got one extra pawn. So material is actually even in this position. But he's got a greater number of pieces, and they're not necessarily better coordinated than our pieces. So we're looking at a potential move like rook takes g2 check. And this move would force his king into the corner. That would be the only move. And his knight is guarding this h2 square. So his pieces aren't necessarily super well coordinated, but they are performing in important defensive functions in the position. Once we play rook takes g2 check, our rook is under attack by the enemy king, which limits the mobility subsequently of our queen to potentially, try to attack his pieces or pick up pieces through some sort of a double attack situation. Our knight is also under attack by the enemy pawn right now. If we do nothing, he's going to take this knight with his pawn, and he also will have a fairly dangerous passed pawn that could potentially promote on c8. His rook on h8 is not really in the action, but it is positioned dangerously close to our king, and it's cutting off these squares here along the 8th rank. And he also has this other rook that's x-raying our king through the knight, and that could lead to potentially dangerous discovered check opportunities where the knight could pick up our rook even. So we have to keep all of those things in mind. If we look at the position before the puzzle creating move, there's already a sense of urgency. There's this really powerful check that we can deliver on g2, but he has potential defensive options. He could maybe play his knight back to f4 and attack the rook and also defend the g2 pawn, but he decided not to play that move. He could maybe get his rook back into the action somehow, and instead he plays a move that's a little bit kind of a small impact move given the gravity of the position that we're looking at. And this is very much a case where there's competing threats in the position, where we have ideas and he also has ideas, and we're trying to see who is going to have the initiative to get their attack through first. So the question is, does this move have enough initiative? We already know that the answer is no to that question. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been the mistake that led to the puzzle. So that's one way that we can reason about it, is, looking at this move and trying to ask ourselves, like, what is wrong with this move that has created the opportunity for there to be a puzzle in this position? So if we were to counter this move with a similarly slow move on our end, we could move the knight to e5 or to d4. So this move creates the threat of taking on f3 with a check. And then after pawn takes or rook takes, then we have rook to g2 check, king h2, rook to h2 check, king g1, and then queen to g2 checkmate. So those variations actually look very promising if we were to move our knight to one of these two squares. The only issue is that if we do one of those two moves and then he takes the knight, it's now with a check. As we had mentioned earlier, his rook is x-raying our king down the f-file. So we wouldn't be able to immediately play rook takes g2 check. We would have to first respond to his check. If we play knight to d4 check, let's just calculate one of these variations. I picked knight to d4 because knight to e5 is a double check. So it's like potentially even more powerful than knight takes d4 check. So let's say he plays that move. We would have to get our king out of the way of the check first. Let's say to g6, we can't go along the 8th rank. and we can't go to f6. So g6 and e6 would be the only two options. G6 looks a little bit safer. It's getting away from the center, and it doesn't allow a follow-up check by the other rook. Then he can take our rook. And after we take back with the queen, we've essentially lost all of our initiative at that point, and we've also lost a lot of material, and we don't have an attack anymore on his king. So for that reason, I don't like knight to d4. Knight to e5 has very much the same issues, except it's with a double check, and we have to go to e6 instead of g6 because this knight is now controlling that square. But the plus side of that is he doesn't have the fork on our rook, or he doesn't have the attack on our rook by his knight. So I guess that's a little bit better. Either way, he's taken our knight, and he can just bounce back to f3 and continue defending his kingside. So that also looks highly suspect, and it doesn't look like it's the correct continuation. We may come back to that later down the line, or try to look a little bit deeper into it. So knight here, and we have to move the king e6, and then let's say he just jumps back to f3, like we had calculated, and I don't see an immediate continuation here to get our attack through his kingside defenses. So is there anything that we can do that's even more forcing than that? Well, we don't really have any ways to check our opponent directly with our queen. Queen d4 check is guarded by the knight. And our knight doesn't really have anywhere to run that's particularly active apart from moving closer to the enemy position. So it seems like our options are a little bit limited with this knight. I'm suspicious of that because we don't have a ton of material to work with in the first place in this position. And if we can't also bring our knight into the attack, the question is kind of like, are we too hindered with just 14 points of material to try to finish off the attack? Or should we be trying to look a little bit deeper and see, are there ways to bring the knight into the attack? We've already looked at the two ways that go most directly into the attack, and they don't really work. So that makes me think that, maybe we should try to think outside the box and think of a different idea here. So if we were to zoom out a little bit more and take a look at this position from another perspective, we can try to assess, are we actually looking for a checkmate, or are we looking to win back a good amount of material? Again, he has the attack on our knight, so if we were to win a knight or a rook, we have to keep in mind that he's going to take our knight the very next move, and he has this pawn that's very dangerous to promotion. His knight is also controlling the advanced square here, and his rook's controlling this square. So his pawn would actually be kind of hard to stop once it is made to c6. So in light of that, and the difficulty with potentially winning material, his pieces are pretty well defended. His rook is in the corner. The only vulnerable piece I can see is maybe this knight on d5, possibly the rook on f1. Maybe there's a move like rook takes g2 check, king h1, and then queen to e2. The benefit of that move is that we're attacking his rook now, so that if he were to play a discovered check move like knight to d4, we can just take his rook, and that would actually be checkmate. But he has a double check, and the benefit of a double check is that we can't capture both pieces that are checking us in the same turn. We have to respond to the check by moving our king. So after king e2, queen e2, he can just play knight e5 check, and then if we were to play king to e6, he would have to move his rook or give a follow-up check. Let's say he goes like rook e8 check, then we can pick up this knight. We mentioned that it's vulnerable. And he doesn't have rook to d1 check because our queen is covering that square. So that actually looks somewhat promising. His knight on e5 is also under attack in that variation, and he doesn't have further checks on the d file because our knight's covering this d8 square, which is very useful. So the double check maybe doesn't look as dangerous as we would otherwise think it to be. Knight h4 check. Oh, okay, sorry about that. Knight h4 check attacking the rook on g2 is also parried by simply queen takes f1 checkmate. But let's go back to the double check situation. Knight to e5, king e6. He no longer has the knight guarding h2. So we have that dangerous threat coming up. And it looks like he can't defend it along with defending queen takes f1 checkmate. So for that reason, the double check doesn't look very strong. Let me just double check. Let me just double check the double check. Knight e5 check, king e6. I'm trying to see what other resources he could possibly have. Maybe like rook e1 and then rook takes h2 check. So that actually looks like it's potentially winning to me. So I'm almost ready to actually commit to that move and play it. Just because we're getting this double attack in on two of his most important defensive pieces, really the only pieces that he have that are playing a defensive role around his king. So that's, I think, why this move is so good. It's kind of a subtle move. It's kind of a quiet move, but it's not as quiet as b5 because this is happening in the immediate vicinity around the enemy king. It's a double attack. There's attack on his rook, and we're threatening like checks. So we are upping the ante in the position on our opponent. Just want to do a couple of last second checks to see if there's anything else he can do. So maybe he can play rook e1. So after queen e2, rook e1. The problem is then we just take the knight for free on f3 because the piece the pawn that was guarding it is no longer present on g2. And then we still have an attack. We're threatening a discovered check now by moving the rook out of the way. And our knight can leap into the action on d4 at any point as well and continue the attack on the enemy king, whereas he doesn't have nearly as much of a threat on our king. We actually have greater king safety, even though we don't have a ton of king safety. So let's go for that variation. Okay, so that was the correct first move, and let's see if this is the second move. Oh, and it's not correct. Okay, so I was very surprised by that. Let's take a look at the analysis. Or actually, we can take a look at this again and see if we can maybe find the better move. Yeah, that's very interesting. Rook takes g2 check was the correct first move, but the question of the second move still remains. Maybe rook to f2, but then he just trades rooks, and I think he's fine at that point. Trades rooks, and then he can just take on c6. But then we would take on f3, and then we could maybe pick up this knight. So maybe rook f2. Let's try it. Okay, it was rook f2, and then you take the knight, and you also pick up this knight. Okay, that's very interesting. So let's see why queen e2 wasn't the correct move. Queen e2, and what does he have from this position? Okay, so it is knight to e5, and this is knight to g5 also works. King e6, only move. And then in this position, every move is losing for white except one move that we missed. Knight to f4 check, forking the forking the king and the queen, which is absolutely amazing. We just missed that. But if it wasn't for that, this variation would have been correct. So it just goes to show how careful you have to be in your calculations. And we weren't creative enough to see rook f2 here. I just thought that I was like missing so much material in the attack that giving up a rook, even in an exchange, would cause me to no longer be able to seek the checkmate. But it does allow me to win back a good amount of material. So if I wasn't completely focused on looking for the checkmate, I may have been able to find this variation and look a little bit deeper into it and see, if we could win back like a good amount of material in the position. So I am going to post this video, even though I got the puzzle wrong. Hope you guys have enjoyed it, and I will see you tomorrow.